Hi, welcome to Real Film Snobs. I'm Angela Yeager.
And I'm Brian Michael. We're on the same side of the table, so that is
This
very
is
strange and
crazy.
odd.
Yeah.
Today we have a very special episode. We have lots of special episodes, but today's a very extra special episode. We're having Scott here, Scott Hossner from Allied Video Productions. Scott's a longtime contributor to our show, been a co-host many times, as well as our technical advisor. And today it's all about that technical advisement that we're going to be asking, because there's been so many. Well, Scott's known it, with our group of friends, we all the time are asking you questions about new televisions, new streaming, the new technology. It gets a bit overwhelming, and we thought, you know what? Let's do a show. Let's do a whole show. When there's all these great movies in the theaters, it's still that important that we need to do this.
I know those who are lucky enough to be in Scott's close group of friends like us get to ask him these questions. So this is a gift to our viewers, because now you get his expertise without, no, you don't get to be in his close group of friends, but you can still get to hear his wonderful knowledge. So.
All right, here we are.
So we get a lot of questions, and I have a lot because I'm not a total Luddite, but I'm pretty close. Not the most up on the technology stuff, but we're both cinephiles, and so we both love a good quality screen that displays our wonderful Criterion collection and other movies, well. So of course that was one thing we wanted to start. I wanted to start with my first number one pet peeve in recent years, and I remember the first time I saw one of these TVs, I just went berserk because I thought I was going crazy and living in an alternative universe, even more so than I usually feel like. The soap opera effect is what I first heard it called. But this is that thing when you're over at someone else's house, not a film snob.
No.
And you're watching a movie and it looks like bad TV or a bad soap opera, but it doesn't look like a movie should look. It doesn't have those dark, rich colors, and people look like they're walking in front of a bad backdrop or something. So explain what this is.
Sure. Well, I can distinctly remember the first time I ever witnessed it was when I upgraded my television set several years ago to one of the newer displays. Was between seasons of Dexter, and I had been watching Dexter with some friends, and so the first time I watched my new TV critically was the season premiere of Dexter, and we all looked at each other and went, what? New directory? I mean, he's shooting this thing on video all of a sudden? I mean, it was really bizarre. So it came as a shock to me too, and I had to do some digging and figure out what was going on before I returned the TV set. Basically, and on today's show, we could probably get too technical, so cut me off if I do. But basically what you're seeing is some features that have been added to modern television sets to smooth out motion judder. And what that is that, just taking a quick step back, films that you watch in the theater are shot in 24 frames per second. Televisions historically in the United States have a 30 frame per second or 60 field per second refresh rate. That's based on our electrical standard, blah, 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 goes back to Thomas Edison. As a result, when a 24 frame per second film is transferred to video, they have to repeat frames every so often so that the movie plays at the correct speed on a 30 frame display. And so there's this thing that's called a 3:2 pull down, blah, blah, blah. If you were to go frame by frame through an old DVD, you would see that every third frame is a repeat. And your eyes don't really perceive that. It looks enough like 24 frames per second that it looks like what you're used to seeing in the theaters. And that's actually a relatively slow frame rate. But we've all grown up in the movie, going to the movies watching 24 frames a second, which is a little bit stuttery compared to video, which is smoother. And it's one of those subconscious things that we're used to, that something has a film-like look when it has that little bit of judder to it. So now flash forward past CRT televisions, which just used a 3:2 pull down, and you get into bigger and bigger displays, and that stuttering effect can be very distracting for certain people, especially on a pan. You might notice a pan looking a little bit jerky. So that in all their wisdom, these television companies came up with this smooth motion, and what they're doing is they're interpolating. And now TVs have not only 60 frames per second, they'll have 120 frames per second or 240 frames per second. And
versus 24.
Versus 24.
Which is what a film, wow, that's quite a bit more, yeah.
And so on a 240 hertz refresh rate, they are repeating. You would ordinarily just repeat the same frame 10 times, then go to the next frame 10 times, and you would have the effect of 24 frames a second. But on a big display, that might look a little jerky. So what they're doing is on these in-between frames, they're creating interpolated frames. They're creating frames that aren't there in order to smooth it out. And the effect, if it's turned on or turned up very high, is this very smooth, plasticky looking film that looks more like video. And it's called the soap opera effect because soap operas used to, and still are, shot on sound stages with video, which is 30 frames a second.
And they don't look very good.
And they don't look very good.
Except for Young and the Restless. They're on film, I believe, still. It's okay.
So soap operas have a distinct look to them, but it's the look of video. There's a little bit more to it in noise and contrast ratio and stuff, but one of the things that tips our brain off to films is that little juddery effect. So if you're buying a new television display, that's almost certainly going to be turned on, and all the manufacturers call it something different, but please, if you love films and the way they're intended to look, you need to turn that feature off or at least turn it way down, and you can experiment a little bit. Unfortunately, there's no consistency in what they're called, so I have my little cheat sheet here. Sony calls it Motion Flow, Samsung calls it Auto Motion Plus, Sharp calls it Aqua Motion, Toshiba calls it Clear Frame or Clear Scan, Vizio calls it Smooth Motion, LG calls it True Motion, just as a little sampling. Most of those have motion in the name, so if you go into the menus and go deep into like advanced video settings, you're going to find these kind of smooth motion kind of features. Generally, it's just on or off. Some manufacturers have like a scale of 1 to 10, and if you think it's a little too juddery, you might put it up to 2. Wouldn't go any higher than that. And then look at it, see what it looks like. But you'll be amazed how different it looks.
So now on this, earmuffs, Angela, earmuffs. We're going to talk sports. We're going to talk sports on the show. I'm so excited because there are some cinephiles who also do love sports.
Right.
You and I are one of those
Yep,
people.
yep.
Actually, most of the people in our group are that ones, except for you. Now for sports, though, I've been told that actually works really well to watch
it's great
that.
for
And
sports.
For watching, the NBA, I love watching my
sports
sister's television set up
are
that way.
generally broadcast.
It wasn't shot on film.
Yeah, they were not shot
Yeah.
on film. They're shot for video, and it generally looks great. It's part of the same reason that some of the sports channels in their high definition broadcasts go with 720 progressive instead of 1080i, because that progressive also is a little smoother motion. And so for sports, it's a great way to look at it. The nice thing is most TV sets, those menu settings are input independent. And what that means is if your Blu-ray player is going into one input and your cable box is going into another, you can turn off the smooth motion on your Blu-ray player input and leave it on your television input.
That's what I wanted to hear.
And it will stay. You won't have to constantly go into the menus and turn it on
Oh,
and
interesting.
off.
So when
that's
you're watching
excellent.
TV, you could leave it on then when
Right.
you're watching movies on your DVD. But if you're watching
Movies on TV, you gotta go
you'd
and
have
turn
to
it
go
off.
and turn it
Yeah.
off. Now what's the deal though with, so we're talking about this and I'm sure there's somebody at home thinking, well, if they're trying to smooth out that jitteriness, and I don't like jitteriness, why wouldn't I just keep the soap opera effect on my TV?
Well,
what if I like
It
stuff
really
that
comes down
looks
to
like
whether you're
bad video? Sorry to sound critical.
if you're a
but-
cinephile and you want to see the movie the way that the director intends you to see it, you want to see it as authentically as possible. So certainly that's the same reason why when letterboxing came out on a 4x3 TV, I insisted on watching films in letterbox because
Right.
that's the way it was shot.
Yeah,
The film
not
was
pan
shot
and
at
scan
20
where they chopped
Right.
off
But
half
see,
the
yeah,
screen.
we've come from pan and scan that was trying to colorize things.
Right.
They've done, we've actually cinephiles have won. Televisions are now letterbox,
Widescreen,
and so a wide screen, which they finally
Right.
figured
They
that
stopped
out. So they've got
colorizing
that.
stuff,
So
yeah.
this is just the next frontier, and this is the next thing I believe that we'll be able to get over, because I don't think that when people start to realize that it's gonna, once they start figuring it out, I think people will make that adjustment.
And it should just be a button on your remote.
It should just
So
be
that
a
way,
button on your
that way
remote.
people can turn it on and off very easily. So if they're watching sports, you can just hit it.
Do
instead
that
of going
again.
deep
Does it
down
make the
into
sound every
menus.
time you hit the button? Because that was
So
awesome.
does that, but in a lot of the TVs, it's not super easy because I've tried to
right.
help someone recently
Right.
and
Your
it was like,
in-laws.
and it was really deep in there and we couldn't figure it out. It was
Right.
so
You
hard.
sometimes have to go like into video, into display settings, into advanced settings, into motion settings. I mean, they could be very deep.
It depends
But
on the
there's-
TV,
It depends
basically.
on the TV,
Yeah.
and there's no way that I could tell you here other than what to look for, and to just go as deep as the menus go and look at every setting in that menu, because you're eventually going to find
Right.
on, I believe, every manufacturer out there does allow you to disable it, and if you really want to see the movie the way it was intended, shut it off.
Is there any sign that they may stop putting those on TVs? Like as if people come, because there's been a lot of complaints about it. Will
Yeah,
they,
I don't know. I think the average
haven't
Joe
heard?
Blow consumer just doesn't care enough to complain.
Or doesn't realize
as
it.
long
My
as
sister
you-
actually likes it. I'm
As long as you can turn it off. that's a good
Yeah,
starting
so at
point.
least they can turn it off, but it's
Right.
hard to imagine people like it. I guess there are some people that like pan and scan too, because they're like,
Right.
oh, I want the
It
picture to
fills
fill
the
the whole
screen.
screen,
Yeah.
even though it cuts off half the image. So,
Right.
Yeah.
okay, so that's our soap opera effect. So do we want to move on to 4K?
Yeah, that's
So
the
that was
one
what
I
you
was
want to know.
about.
So 4K, what is the deal with 4K? As someone who has a extremely old
Oh
TV,
my
we won't even
gosh.
talk about how
Dude,
old
I've
my
got a plasma. I don't have a tube. Well, the tube's behind the plasma because I'm white trash, and I can't get rid of my tube because I really love the tube. But yeah, somebody still has a tube.
Okay. So 4K. Whether you like it or not, 4K is coming down the pike. It's already essentially all the displays you buy over about 50 inches are 4K televisions already. So, like it or not, if you're going to buy a display of any size in the next few years, you're going to probably be buying a 4K TV. And just like every other technology, they're not all created equal. But just to kind of step back, when television first came out, it was basically 720 by 480 pixels equivalent. Then when high definition came out, it was 1920 by 1080. So it went widescreen and like 4 times as many pixels, and we all remember seeing the first high definition broadcast. It was really stunning to look at. 4K is the next step. It goes from roughly 2 million pixels on the screen to roughly 8 million pixels on the screen. So it is a huge step up in total number of pixels on a screen. That said, the average person sitting looking at 4K next to even side by side with a 1080p set are unlikely to see the difference unless you have a screen display of about 40 to 50 inches or larger. So it's really ideal for large displays. It used to be sometimes people would say, how far do you have to sit from your set? You know, so you had a 25-inch TV, how far should I sit away from it? And the rule was like 8 times the diagonal measurement of your TV. So, you know, you have to be,
Oh my God.
4 feet away minimum or whatever. So, so now, really, because the resolution gets sharper and sharper, you can have a bigger set and be closer to it. So it's not unusual for people to have a 70-inch TV in the living room and be sitting 5 feet from it. And it's a perfectly acceptable image quality because of how dense the pixels are. But there's a lot of misnomers about 4K. One of them is that if you buy a 4K TV, it does not mean that anything you're looking at is actually 4K. Unless you have 4K content properly connected to your 4K TV, you're not looking at 4K. If you just hook a Blu-ray player into a 4K TV, you're looking at 1920 by 1080 on a 4K display. So all those pixels.
1920? Oh, that's what Blu-ray is showing
Yeah,
you?
or what would be called 1080p. So that was the highest quality that a regular Blu-ray could put out. You watch that on a 4K TV, you're still seeing 1080p. So the best way, if you really care about getting a big set and looking at 4K content, looking at all those 8 million pixels, get a big set, like 60 or 70 inches, so you can appreciate it. Get a 4K Blu-ray player. Not a 4K upscaling player, but an actual 4K Blu-ray player.
Okay, what is an upscaling player? Because
That
I've
just
never
means-
even
That's
heard.
a
I've never even heard of
So
that.
some of the cheap 4K players can just play a regular Blu-ray and they upscale it to 4K, which means nothing basically. It's just duplicating pixels.
So they're just cheap
They're
Blu-ray
just-
players
they're just
with
cheap 4K players.
upscaling.
Yeah. Some of them,
okay.
so they can't even play a 4K disc. So then you have to buy movies that are 4K. So they're
Yeah,
packaged.
that's
They're about
right.
$5 more. They look like a Blu-ray package, but the
Yeah.
package is generally black.
Yeah.
The nice thing is, if you think you're going to go to 4K sometime in the future, start buying the 4K discs now because they're all packaged with a regular Blu-ray as well. So you can, if you want to pay the $3 or $4 extra now, you'll have the Blu-ray, and when you buy the 4K technology.
Is the
so if
4K
you
disc
connect-
also Blu-ray, or is that not?
No, it's a separate
Blu-ray.
disc. They call it a 4K Blu-ray, but it's a separate kind of disc. So in that packaging will be a 4K
You're
disc.
too behind now.
I don't even have
There'll
Blu-ray
be a
yet.
4K disc and a Blu-ray side by side, and you get both for the price of one. They do that
That's
just
why
to
I
help.
just like going to the theater. They just project it big, and I don't have to
And
do
there you go.
anything. There it
And
is.
for reference, movie theaters are projecting in 4K, almost all of them. So you go to any of the local cinemas that have digital projection, 4K, and they blow it up on a huge screen, and it looks great. So 4K is a whole lot of pixels. So anyway, you got to have a 4K player and a 4K TV hooked up properly.
In order to play.
In order to see 4K in all its true glory. Now, there are also streaming options
Okay,
for
there's
4K.
one,
So
yeah.
Netflix, Hulu, Amazon Prime, I think all have 4K options. I think you pay a couple dollars extra per month to stream 4K. But I can't emphasize this enough. Not all 4K is created equal. 4K that is streaming over the internet is highly, highly compressed. So yes, you have 8 million pixels, but the quality of what you're seeing is not going to be the same as you see on a 4K film that comes off of a disc because it's so highly compressed in order to feed it over the internet. And for people that don't know what compression is, you've probably been watching a Netflix movie in a dark room, and it's a dark scene, and there's the black looks kind of chunky up in the corner or whatever, and it might move
shadowy,
around. Yeah, exactly.
amoebas looking shaped things.
Yeah, and that's compression errors. It's
sit at
just
your
like
place.
JPEGs. And so 4K streaming has big quotes around it because it's not full 4K quality.
Because this would have to be whatever your bandwidth can handle, right?
And
basically?
whatever the
internet,
and now that we have internet neutrality gone bye-bye, who knows what the internet companies could crimp down on Netflix and shrink the pipe in essence in order to provide more bandwidth to a paying customer. And so who knows what's coming. That being said, bandwidth keeps getting better and better in general. So 4K TV, but then again, not all 4Ks are created equal. There's what's called HDR 4Ks. If you're going to invest in a 4K TV, you probably want to look for HDR.
Oh, God.
Is that something different than regular 4K?
Yes.
HDR?
HDR. It stands for a high dynamic range.
Okay.
And it just gives you a bigger spectrum of color and darkness to brightness contrast ratio. So basically, they're brighter sets that are able to display colors more vividly and can, to a point, be hard on a really bright scene. You almost need to put on sunglasses. But that's going to give you the most contrast ratio.
Is that what you told me to get if I ever get a TV? No.
I don't remember what I told you.
You told me, because I said I want something that looks the most like movie. So this is weird, but I actually would really, I know plasma's gone or already gone or on its way out, but I love the look of plasma because it's dark, and I love
Where
the
do
look
you see
of
plasma?
your house.
Oh, that's my place.
Well, my
That's
parents,
right.
my parents and back in Phoenix have and it
Yeah,
looks
sure.
gorgeous.
Right.
I mean, it's dark. I know it's super not energy efficient, but it looks really good.
So here's the deal with plasma is that when flat screen TVs came out, hands down, plasma was a better display technology than LCD. But it has not kept up with the Joneses as far as resolution, and certainly from an energy savings and weight standpoint, hanging a plasma TV on your wall could be like hanging 100 pounds. Hanging a current LCD TV could be like 20 pounds. So it's a huge difference in the engineering it takes to mount it on your wall. And there are a lot of different LCD technologies. They're not all created equal. Generally, you do get what you pay for. LCDs used to have a backlight in them that was literally fluorescent tubes.
Yeah, so they look, I know. I remember I'd go over to people's homes and see their new flat screens and go, I don't think these look very good. They're really bright. And
right, and they had, and those lights could burn out back there. Yeah. And then they started backlighting LCDs with LED lights, which are more energy efficient. And now if you look at the good ones, there's about 1 million little lights back behind it so they can light up certain areas of the screen and not others as backlighting to help that contrast ratio, dynamic backlighting it's called. And that helps a lot. There's organic LEDs, OLEDs coming along. That's a very expensive technology, but every single pixel is a light in and of itself at that microscopic level, so there is no backlight anymore. And that really looks
That's the
phenomenal.
kind you said, but that's more expensive. OLED?
OLED, organic light emitting diodes.
Okay. Yeah,
So
that's
those
what
will
you
get
said
cheaper
looks
with
more
the-
cinematic, but
Right.
it's really expensive.
Did
you write that
technology right
down?
OLED.
now. Oh, LED. No, I
Okay.
remembered it from when he told me
People
before.
hopefully are taking notes.
Yeah, probably a good thing to do. So, yeah, but when you were talking about compression earlier, it reminded me of something. My husband's an audiophile, so different from a cinephile, but, for him, he can't, the way a lot of people listen to music on their phones, he can't, it's just for audiophiles.
MP3 file, yeah.
It's a nightmare because to him, he can hear how poor the sound quality is versus even a CD, which is much higher, versus a record, which is even higher. And of course, reel to reel was, the prime because you were hearing so much, because people don't record at that rate, and when they have to compress it down, the music way down, and so you lose all this color and dynamic in the sound. So for audiophiles, a lot of them just can't stand MP3s, which is what like most people listen to music these days on, right? And he just, it's not that he never does, but it's really hard, especially for stuff that's supposed to have a lot of dynamic range.
It's
and so
a
to me, it
trade-off.
reminds me
It's
of
a
the same
trade-off
thing.
so CDs that were made of WAV files at 48K sample rate, right? And so let's look at your cell phone here, right? If you loaded this up with WAV files, you could put 8 or 10 hours worth of music on here. You load it up with MP3 files, and you can put hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of music on here.
Right.
And that's why people have learned to sacrifice quality for quantity. And many people can't hear the difference because they don't know how it should sound.
Right, which is like the people that say they can't tell the movie looks bad on their TV.
Cheap little earbuds.
Well, there's also an age too. A certain point in time,
You're listening to it on earbuds that are, have a low.
Don't have good sound quality anyway.
But they're
yeah.
convenient. You're right. You don't want to walk around with big. Although walking around the streets of New York, you see a lot of people these days with big headphones on and blocking out the
That's come
outside
back.
world.
Thanks to Dre and others. Yeah, put the big headphones back in.
So you can certainly hear it better and more
Right.
appreciate lower compression.
Right,
of
but that's a
music.
good example, like a WAV file, which
Yep.
is some services do offer downloads and WAV files is much larger. It's still not as large as, what you could record at, but it's better
Absolutely.
than an MP3. So
Right,
there's all
right.
these differences. But that's what you were reminding me of with the compression
And
rate.
it's
People
exactly
say,
the
"Oh, I want to
same
spend
thing.
all this money on 4K," but then they're not actually watching very much in
Right,
4K.
or they
so.
like the convenience of Netflix, so they're willing to put up with a little lower picture quality versus buying, the money you might invest in having to buy the films in 4K on a disc that's $30 a movie or whatever.
Right.
So it really does come down to what your priorities are. But speaking of that, that's another topic I want to talk about, was just kind of how things are changing as far as how people
Subscriptions?
subscribe to things,
Yeah.
how people buy them
Yep.
on the internet
Right.
versus buying a disc, and kind of the advantages and disadvantages of that. Part of this is generational. I'm sure that the generations after us will think it's weird to buy a hard disk and put it on a shelf. From one standpoint, it's the best quality you can get currently,
Right.
is on a disc.
Yeah, because most of us don't have film projectors.
Right.
So that would be cool.
And
Right.
once you own it forever. Say for your house getting broken into or burning down, that disc is yours forever.
Yeah.
Correct.
If you read the user agreement on most of these sites where you're downloading movies and even buying them, there's no guarantee that 20 years from now that service is still going to be around and you're still going to have access to that movie.
Correct.
Even if you download it to your hard drive, what happens when your computer fails? Because your computer is going to fail. Everybody's computer fails eventually. Is there a redundancy in order to get that film back? My favorite story, and it's not related to movies, is related to books, but when the Amazon Kindle came out, one of the early titles they had available was 1984, ironically. And a lot of people went on Amazon and bought 1984 and downloaded it onto their Kindle. And some days or weeks later, there was a fight with the publisher, and they apparently didn't have the rights to sell it on Amazon Kindle. So Amazon went into everybody's Kindle and pulled that book out of there. It's no longer there. And they give you a $5 credit on your account, which is what you paid for the book. But I thought about that, and it's like, well, if I had gone to the bookstore and bought 1984, and they didn't have the right to sell me that book, no one could break into my house, take that book, and leave a $5 bill on my counter.
You would hope, yeah, that they can't do.
At least not in today's America. Maybe next year, but not this year. So it's a different level of ownership when someone can come and take it away from you.
Right.
And so I still have a strong preference for, if it's something I really like and I want to have it, great, I'm going to buy it. If it's just something I'm going to watch once, rent it. But I'm not going to buy it electronically generally, as a rule. But it really is it's a generational thing.
Yeah, because a lot of people do buy movies online and they
Right.
don't believe in owning them. And, I could see it to a certain degree, less space, you have to, but to me, it's like if I really love the movie, I really want to own the movie.
Right.
And it's not just the movie, it's the extras that come with it, especially if you're a fan of Criterion and other sets like that have
Correct.
director's commentaries and all those extra goodies.
that you don't get there.
With
And,
streaming,
and similarly, before I forget, iTunes in particular, if you're buying movies or music there and building up a huge collection, that is not transferable upon death. So when you die, you can't give your iTunes collection to somebody the way you can give your record collection to somebody. So when you die, it
I
goes
never
away.
thought about that.
And so,
Interesting.
yeah.
So you couldn't, if you have a great film library or record
put that in your
collection.
will.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'll
you
leave
can't
you
say,
my
here's,
iTunes."
here's all my
You're willing
music
to back
from
to Steve
iTunes.
Jobs.
Or
Actually, you just
wherever.
say, "Here's my iTunes password."
Yeah.
They don't have to know I'm dead, but who's paying it? If you had it a credit card, then your name.
So, but and that's another huge point you
didn't
made,
know
which
that.
is the bonus content that you
Yeah.
get. And I've told many people this: if I liked a movie, I'm not sure if I'm going to buy it, and I look on the back and it has a director's commentary. That's the selling point for me. Because you can experience a movie a couple more times in a much more interesting way, listening to what the director had to say.
If they
about
have
it
a good
out loud.
commentary, especially.
Yeah, for sure. And not all commentaries are the same, but those kind of bonus features you generally
Right.
don't get.
They got to start
on
streaming those. Then we're
content.
going to be in trouble because that's going to be really tough. Because with me, now we're talking about 4K, and I'm like, gosh, I still have DVDs, and I got started going to do Blu-rays, and now I go, oh my goodness, now I got 4. And there are certain titles I will want to update, the Godfather trilogy and the like, and that gets to be another one I got to buy it again, another one to buy it again, because there's my sister's all the time sending me movies that for Blu or on DVD because she's bought the Blu-ray. And I'm like, oh yeah, I don't own those even on DVD, so I'll take those. But
Sure.
it's another upgrade thing. So that's one of the drawbacks. And that's usually what I'm told by my nephew and others because I don't want to keep upgrading. And why would I pay $10 a month to have title and have everything, for music as opposed to
That said,
owning.
the same thing is true if you buy a digital copy. You're buying it in today's quality, and if they release it later in 4K, they're not gonna give it to you.
Yeah, they're gonna sell it to you.
They're gonna
again.
sell it to you
They'll,
again.
they'll break into your house and
Yeah.
put it on the counter, take the DVD, take the Blu-ray, leave the
So-
4K with a $5
And I know we
bill.
don't have a lot of time, but doesn't that bring up, I mean, maybe, I know most people aren't worried about privacy issues, but for me, one of the things with streaming in general is that, you are, there are privacy issues involved with that.
sure,
Sort of
I
like
know.
what you talked about, being able to go in and take stuff out. There's also been issues with streaming services putting things in. Music you didn't buy just appearing because that band wanted to promote it, or,
Right.
them knowing exactly what you're listening and watching, and maybe a lot of people don't care, but it is an issue for some people.
Yeah,
So-
absolutely. There's always unintended consequences of technology. I'm not one to say one is better than the other. Just understand the choices you're making and go with it. But at least understand that with streaming and digital purchases, there are potential drawbacks. It could potentially go away someday. If you don't have some sort of backup copy, you
Right.
could lose it all. Much easier than you can lose hard media.
So is anything else on the horizon? You mentioned this thing that I've already forgotten, the H something type of, what was it?
HDR, high
This is
dynamic.
why I
HDR.
told you to write them
He
down.
has my pen.
Oh, here's your
HDR.
pen.
Thanks.
HDR.
HDR. I'm
There's
going to write it
certainly-
down now.
There's certainly going to be 6K and 8K displays coming
Oh, yeah.
down the pike. Now, if you think, as I said, a 4K display can be overkill, an 8K display is dramatically overkill.
Would you have to have like 100?
You'd have to be watching in a movie theater
For it to
to
be able to
justify
notice
that kind of pixel count, in my opinion.
Someday.
One thing we didn't talk about is projection
Oh.
and having projectors in your home. Some people ask me about that.
Projection versus a TV.
Yeah, so like the theater room at our office, we have a big projection
Yeah.
screen. The nice thing about projection is you can project just about any size your wall will allow. If you get a good enough projector, it'll hold up at that size. You can get a nice 4K projector. They are not inexpensive. But the thing with projectors to understand, and this is what I have to constantly harp on people about, is you can only get ideal projection in a pitch black room. Which is why when you go to the movie theater and they have a $70,000
Yes,
film
that's right.
projector up there,
Yeah.
they still turn out the lights.
Lights, yeah.
So you have to have a room with no windows, and you have to be willing to turn off all the lights, or at least dim the lights to just enough to see your way around, because otherwise the light washes out the image, so you'll lose that contrast ratio. A movie screen, before you turn on the projector, is black. You can't project darkness, you can only project light. So whatever that screen looks like before you turn on the projectors, that's your black. So if you can see a white screen in your room, that's the darkest image you're
we
going
got
to
to
get.
catch up there. We are going to run down out of there. So
This is so
as
awesome.
always,
I think we have
still
to have
wanna
a part
thank
2
everybody
really
for
soon. Yeah.
watching the show. Have a great
Thanks to
day
Scott.
and great movies.